split in two, and figuring out just what is going on is a toss-up. I'm Taylor.
And I'm Jonathan. This episode we're finishing up The Death of Jane Lawrence by Caitlin Starling. And I think, similar to last episode, we're going to start off with just a bit of a disclaimer. I think our vibes on this book were not positive.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
So we may be a bit critical again, and just throwing it out there again, respect what Caitlin Starling has done with this book. She mentions in her acknowledgments working on it for 5 years, like, kudos, that's a lot of work. We're going to not feel super great about it, and that's just our personal opinion. And we encourage you to disagree with everything we say.
Books are subjective. You're not going to like everything. I happen to not like a lot of things, apparently, as this podcast has shown over and over. So,
and I feel like I came into this knowing it might be rough because it had the historical fiction tag. I think there's so many reasons this book doesn't work for me that don't have to do with the historical fiction, unfortunately. And there was also just my general disagreement with that tag from the last episode. But yeah, we try. I feel like every episode we try to choose a book that we're going to vibe with, and it's tough. I think I'm starting to learn that maybe like I think with this book and any book we've read before, a lot of times it just has to do with audience, like intended audience, and whether or not we are that. And I don't feel like we are that for this, for sure. I think a problem I'm running into as we look for books for this podcast is that book blurbs don't really feel accurate. Mm-hmm. I acknowledge that book blurbs are kind of more for the purpose of selling books and getting people to open them more so than to be accurate descriptions of what's going to happen in the book. And I feel like with this book and other ones that we've read that I've been disappointed by it has been a bit of a mismatch between the description of the book and what I'm like, therefore setting a certain expectation, and then what I actually get out of the book.
Yeah, and speaking more like broadly, I also think something interesting happening in a lot of creative works is like quotability. So like you want the snappy blurb.
Right, you want the thing that people post on their Goodreads review.
Yeah, which you could take, just a couple lines of it and like post it across the internet and it'll gain traction. Or you write in such a way where you have good lines, but those lines might not necessarily make any fucking sense.
Right.
Because you're looking for like that clippability. I think that's happened in like music, it happens in books. I don't know. That just might be in my own head.
No, I think you make a good point, because during the chapter 0 portion, I felt like there was an attempt to be really poetic.
Yeah.
That didn't really land with me because it felt like that's what it was trying to do, right? Like and I make that distinction from, like, I guess the distinction here is between being poetic and sounding like you're trying to be poetic. I didn't feel like it was really warranted in that part of the book. It didn't really flow. And I think in a book, as we're going to discuss with many contradictions, it didn't fit because I felt needed something concrete. I think the parts of the book that were supposed to be concrete weren't. And so like having all of this kind of, poetic speak and, floweriness and abstract, nonsensicalness, it didn't work for me. Maybe it would have worked in other books. I feel like that's not actually that uncommon in horror type things, to keep it a little vague and non-specific. But in this book, it was about all I was looking forward to was maybe some explanation, and that's not what happened.
Yeah, I think it's easy to purple prose, which is like that super flowery, like you really get in the weeds of language and describing things. I feel like this was a lot of that. It was just about like the math. She really purple prosed the math. And sometimes it was like, this does not need to go on this long. We're talking about circles again. And for the longest time, I thought the circles already had symbols in them. Like I thought they were like actual magic, like circles, like spell work. They were just circles. I was like,
just circles, yeah.
Just circle. I was blown away. I was so baffled.
No, it really ran with the salt and chalk thing that we talked about last episode.
Yeah, but it was just, the attempt to be kind of abstract and ethereal. And sometimes it hits, right? But like, sometimes it just feels like a lot of nonsensical ramblings. Which could it have fit in this book? I suppose, based on what Jane is going through, but I don't know.
I think it just had to fit into something else.
Yeah. Maybe if Jane wasn't, like, it's weird because there's a dissonance, right, between the Jane of, like, the first 2 chapters and then the Jane of the rest of the book. Because she's very to the point in the beginning. She's to the point, she's logical, she has a lot of will, but she also makes a lot of sense. And then we get into this romance, which doesn't make any sense, which is highly emotional. And then even her obsession with zero and the abstract math doesn't make a lot of sense, especially when you're dealing with somebody who deals in sums. Like, math does make sense. Like, money math does make sense.
Right.
It's very grounded. But we quickly, like, abandoned all of those aspects of Jane and just made her so high level and so obsessed with high level that it felt like a completely different character. It was weird.
You're making a lot of sense here.
Oh, good.
I hadn't thought about it that way, but that is true, right? Like, there is a difference between, like, the accounting kind of arithmetic math and the, like, how can we play with the definition of numbers to redefine math? Like, there's like you're right, like a whole abstract level that would maybe befit like a math PhD going on here, which is maybe why, like, he recommends that she go to school at the end. I guess that part makes sense, but it is two totally different types of thing going on, and they're being justified as one.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of things are, like, there's the attempt to simplify and, like, make a lot of complicated things one thing, even when they contradict. Like, that's the whole thing with magic, is it's unreality, but it has to be based in reality. It's a magical proof that needs follow through, but you don't need to know anything, but you need to know every aspect. So it's like so many contradictions.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter. Like, there's many things in this book, particularly this, that I just feel the book would have been the same without it. If anything, just a little easier to read.
Yeah, I mean, I will say magic, difficult, right?
Yeah.
to make it. But she did have the benefit of having an entirely new universe that could have been grounded in whatever she wanted. But she did make it basically this world.
Yeah, she even mentioned it in her acknowledgments, actually, where she called it like an off-kilter England or something like that. It's like, okay, we're going to acknowledge it.
Yeah. And then we've seen this before where an author tries to explain and then just over-explains to the point where it doesn't make sense or doesn't even feel satisfying. Like, you want the answers, but the answers you're giving me, like, aren't fitting. Like, they don't make sense because you're trying to force an answer. It's like, magic can just be magic. Like, it can not make sense, and that's fine.
I agree that you can just let it not make sense, but when there's an explanation for what they have decided the magic is, it makes me think, like, this is what you grounded the book on, right? Like, I feel like my issues with the book then come down actually to the early stages where it's like, what I don't like isn't even just the delivery of the book. I think it's actually just the world you did create. Like, what you based this all on was insufficient for what I would expect for a book like this. Maybe it works for someone else, or maybe that's just what the author liked, but, like, that wasn't the sort of foundation I wanted for this book.
Yeah, it definitely felt like similar to that towards the end, where a lot more magic is being used. Like, the foundation fell off because suddenly we're using magic almost willy-nilly. Like, everybody, like, Jane is just using magic however she wants. And we're not trying to list the proofs of how we get there, or the proofs we are listing, in my head, don't make sense. So it is like the very foundation you're basing this off of, you've kind of written yourself into a corner. Like, why would you base it so heavily on logic and math and then either not follow through with it or try to follow through with it, but, like, in a way that's not even sufficient? In particular, I'm thinking of the book moment. Do you remember when she moves the book on the shelf?
Yes.
She lists it as she needs to know every aspect of the book to be able to move it. But in my head, the proof, and you can correct me, you're more the math person than I am, but in my head, the proof would be more focused on how you're moving the book and not the book itself. Because if you have an equation and you're transforming it into something else, like, that movement is more important than what the equation is.
I see what you're saying. Like, it's more about the change that it undergoes than the object itself, or, like, a variable itself.
Right. So it's like, in that use of magic, I guess sure, you might need to know what the book is so that you can adequately, like, put it somewhere else. But more than that, how are you moving it from A to B? How are you kicking Mrs. Pearl and Mrs. Lethbridge out of the house. Like, how is any of that happening? It just feels like insufficient either explanation or we get no explanation.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of like, it was done. What can you say?
I think, I mean, that's an interesting point because I didn't even really think that deep about that book scene because to me, like, she kind of gets into the whole, well, you just need to know it thing. And then to me, nothing else mattered. So like, oh, like if you just like tell yourself you know something, then you can make it happen. That's kind of what it was giving, right? Like, I felt like the book thing, she was just visualizing it in her head until she could switch from saying, I believe the book is moving to, I know the book has moved. And then just like having that change in mindset was enough to make the book move. Like, that's the limit to how I interpreted this stuff, because to me, like the math either over explained or didn't align with the actions that were happening. And so I kind of just scooted it off to the corner and was like, okay, all that matters is that she knows.
Yeah, which is also so weird because it's not just like knowing the belief of something is happening. From my understanding, you also need to know something to its fullest and like know the possibilities of it. Like, you need to know something entirely, which happens when Augustine gets brought back. Like, there's gaps in him because she does not know him entirely. The reason Elodie cannot be brought back is because Lawrence did not know her entirely. And it's like, that's impossible. You cannot know everything about something to a like definitive degree.
And also like the implication that the other people who are more visible were more known. She is in that, she gets that one vision of Elodie when she first goes down to the crypt for initiation, right? She's able to see people she's never seen, so.
I don't know if that's because of a chapter 0 thing where she's kind of existing outside of time. But you're right, she sees like Elodie's family and Lawrence is his family, and Elodie is like non-existent, right? Because she's been like kind of, her placement in memory has been kind of minimized to when she dies because of what Lawrence did, is my understanding of what happened. The only thing about those people is, I don't know if she is magicking anything there, though. Like, there is the question of why she's getting these visions, like, but I'm assuming it's the chapter 0 stuff. Yeah, I don't think she needs to know them. But I guess she would, though, right? Because if she was 0 and she was giving herself that vision,
right,
would she not need to know that moment and the people there to be able to recall it? Like, because they're part of that moment, they're part of what she would have to know. That is a good point. See, it just doesn't, when you get down to like the nitty gritty of it and try to explain it, it doesn't make sense. And that could be fine if you did some like, hand waving, you could work it out, but there are just some things in this book that are kind of just like, meh, we don't need to think about it. We'll move on. And you just kind of have to take it.
But where's the fun in that?
I know. Especially when you're basing everything on logic and math. Like, everything should be explainable.
Yeah. One thing I was thinking with the blankness that was Elodie in that one scene, and less so with the holes in Augustine, but when they are doing this surgery at the end, right? Like, where they're trying to extract this mass from Jane and then she like transcends or whatever. I kind of thought maybe Elodie was vacant because the ritual's like trying to rid the house of the spirits, and because this all kind of started from the whole Elodie situation, maybe what was actually happening in order to rid the house of the spirits was like ridding Elodie from having existed or something like that, or like at least from their lives or the house's memory, something that because she kind of, Jane, chapter 0 version Jane kind of panics a bit when Elodie isn't present. So I was like, oh, maybe it's because like as though she's gonna like stop existing, and like, okay, maybe that's because you guys are like literally trying to ritual her away.
Interesting.
It doesn't really like pan out to anything that comes afterwards doesn't necessarily confirm that at all, but or support it, but that's kind of at least how I saw it when I was reading it.
Yeah, I think there is a bit where Jane notes the blankness and does think of it as Lawrence's first spell having reduced Elodie to one instance of herself. But what you're saying could make sense in like basically what is happening to Jane and what she causes to happen because of chapter 0 is kind of like a rewriting of what happened to Elodie, right? It's like the same circumstances, the same spell. Both of them die, but one of them gets to come back. So it could be kind of like an overwriting of her existence in the house, and like, yeah, cleansing of it through that. That would make sense. I don't know if that's what the author was intending, but
Yeah, I would have to agree. But that would make sense too, because Jane has her whole like, I'm kind of Elodie. Like she's like, is it that I'm Elodie? And then immediately is like, no, I'm not Elodie. But like maybe that's like it's part of the matching there.
right. Like the thing with Elodie is so strange because we thought she was going to be an actual character. It turns out it was just Jane the entire time.
Mm.
But we get like a journal of her, right? And for some odd reason, most of it gets skipped over. I guess we don't really care. But it would have been such a good moment to get insight in Elodie and even Lawrence, especially if like knowing Lawrence mattered so much in regards to bringing him back. It just would have been an interesting time to travel back a bit and like give voice to this woman that was basically brutally murdered in this house. And has basically, as a memory, I suppose, existed in this one instance.
Yeah.
For years. But I don't know if this book actually cares about women. So.
Yeah. Well, I have to agree with that.
We've dealt with, like, the magic stuff. I guess, yeah, the other most important part in this is Jane as a character.
She does become the main character kind of in the second half.
Yeah, in a weird way in which she also does not have a choice in what happens.
Sure.
Because of herself.
I mean, it still is about Augustine, right? Like her whole thing is like having to save him, so it's still about him. But at least it's like her, like it's focused on her actions in this, and not Augustine at all.
Yeah, it's a weird mix of like she does want to save Augustine, but it does eventually kind of switch a bit to, I mean, being about guilt. Even though in my head, a more satisfying realization would be that neither of these characters should feel guilty. They made a bad choice, but sometimes you make the wrong call. That's what happens. Yes. Especially Jane. She did nothing wrong, really, but she still feels guilty as hell for no reason.
Well, she didn't show up to the house like 20 times.
Well, she's just a girl. What can you say? But there's like a switch where caring about Augustine kind of turns into like her just kind of wanting to stay for herself.
Yeah.
Because of, I guess, magic.
That's true.
And like how enticing it is. But then also that is basically immediately cut down by the ending of this book. So I guess it doesn't matter.
Well, yeah. No, I thought that part was interesting where she's like, yeah, like the apparition version of Augustine or whatever it is. When that one comes back and he's like, oh, like Jane, we should really like leave and like go back to the surgery or whatever. And she's like, I know I just saved you after you were like trapped down there and like that was supposed to be my whole goal, but actually my goal was to do magic. So the fact that you're back doesn't change the fact that I want to stay here and finish this ritual. I was like, oh man, we've just lost it at this point.
This isn't in the trigger warnings list, but genuinely trigger warning for sexual assault here. Like,
yeah,
it gets kind of messy because Lawrence is not a human, but we think he is in this moment. And he is obviously fucked up mentally. She kind of is too, but she acknowledges that she is going to sleep with him, basically, to manipulate him so that they will stay. And I would just like to make it very clear that is sexual assault. He cannot consent in that moment.
Yeah.
Because he's obviously not in the know that he's being manipulated. So that was crazy to me.
Something like this happened when they slept together the first time. Didn't he use sleeping together as like a deflection tactic?
She mentions it. She's like, I learned it from him. And I was like, did this come up before? I don't even remember.
Yeah. I think it's what like they only sleep together one other time, right? And I think it was that time where he's like trying to keep her from was he trying to keep her from the house? Wasn't it at the house? I forget what the context was, but I do know that that's at least how she interpreted it, was that he was using it to deflect. Maybe to deflect conversation about Elodie.
Which, like, valid. If she thinks she got taken advantage of in that moment, then that's fine. It's not fine for her to do it back.
Right, back. Yes. The revenge is not exactly the move. Yeah. It's just awfully fast, right? Like, I mean, I guess she's clearly not in her right head either, because really, like, there's just not, these are not reasonable decisions, right? Like, to be like, oh, I've gotten you back, but now I'm going to stay here. Like, I don't know. And then, to sleep with him. It just, neither of those decisions really line up for me.
Right. I mean, it also doesn't make sense because she wants to stay for magic purposes, I'm assuming.
I guess until learn more about Elodie, yeah?
I was going to say, also, to do the ritual, she needs to not have sex.
Oh, yeah.
That's part of the rules. So I'm like, why does she want to stay in the house if she's going to fuck up her chances?
I kind of thought that the ritual was messed up to begin with because I guess it didn't really explicitly say this, but when she called it deprivation, I kind of thought that meant like isolation. Like I thought she wasn't going to be able to talk to anyone, but then like, you know, Mrs. Pearl and Mrs. Lethbridge are around.
I think it's Lethbridge. Am I crazy?
Oh my God.
We should figure it out.
It just shows the relevance, I guess.
I get what you mean, though. I definitely thought it was...
Oh, you're right. It's Lethbridge.
Lethbridge. Like, complete isolation.
My thought when I thought that it was isolation as part of it was, oh, okay, she's going to have to like tell them to take a vacation or something. You know, like tell them like, you guys get a week of holiday, and they're going to be like, huh, what? And like argue about it. But that's not what happened. Like she just danced around it. She kind of told Mrs. Pearl that she was going to be doing some weird shit, but I guess that was insufficient because of how weird the stuff was. Then she just kicked them out. I don't know. Seems like there was a better way to handle that part.
It was strange. Like, she was having Lethbridge basically there to make the food for her, right? Even though she was, like, portioning it later anyway. But why not just have Pearl go on vacation and just have Lethbridge come in, like, once a day and make your food and then leave?
Yeah. This is one of those things, like, one of the things I've been hesitant to say, but I think it might be true, is that I think Jane is kind of written to be a drama queen a bit. Like she seems to, and I think because what really is happening is like kind of like some other things we've talked about. It's just things are being written into happening that don't feel natural just for like the plot point of it, right? Mm-hmm. And I felt like this was maybe one of those times. I think there's kind of a number of times where Jane is either upset or like kind of acting in a large manner, for lack of better words, where I'm like, I don't know if this is really like in line with the character of Jane we've had. What it does feel like is a moment of drama that was written for Jane to forcibly experience. And so then that makes it seem like Jane is coming off as like seeking sort of these more dramatic interactions and like making a scene, which like I think then contributes to like the poor writing of this woman character, you know, because of association with stereotype, right? So I don't know if that's just my reading of it, but those forced parts had kind of a negative effect on the way she came off as a character.
No, you're not crazy. The issue is, right, and she notes this several times, even during like her big she's about to die moment, she's like, I can fix the house, I can fix myself for being such a stain upon this earth. Like, Jane doesn't make sense as a character. She, in a human way, is full of contradictions herself, which, I mean, people can contradict themselves, but in regards to her trauma and how she like sees herself but then also sees herself, like things just aren't aligning. And normally I would say, well, not every victim is perfect, you know, Taylor, get it together, stop being so judgmental. But this is a book, so I'm gonna be judgmental. Yeah, because she obviously has survivor's guilt, which is told to us a couple different times. Mm-hmm. But then she also has her issues with the Cunninghams, where she tries to be the good, easy child for them and feels like she's kind of distant from them and they were kind of distant from her, which doesn't make sense, by the way.
That's not how it read from the first part of the story.
Correct, because she's like 15 years wasn't enough time to really develop a relationship with them. I'm like, first of all, that's an entire like human lifetime, 15 years. Like, you're not fully developed, but you're almost there. Yeah. And you are doing the books for Mr. Cunningham, and also he's supporting you and your crazy ass plan. You guys are close. I don't know how to tell you this. You're close. And there's just no scenario in my head where the Cunninghams were distantly warm, which is how she describes them. Like, you obviously found safety in them. I don't think that happens by them being distant, but maybe I'm crazy.
The thing that counts it out for me with the trauma part is the end, right? Because and I'm sorry, this is the very end I'm hopping to, but they decide they're going to move to Camhurst. And it takes approximately 2 lines of explaining away for that to happen. And so for me, like, on top of the fact that that was just kind of used as like oh, don't forget she's got PTSD, like kind of just as a casual side point to the plot, it doesn't make sense to me that it would be such a big deal to her and be so easy to brush off. Like, oh, it just feels small now. Like, I don't really think that's how trauma works, right? Like, I don't know, like, I'm no psychologist, but it doesn't feel to me like that should have been sufficient for her to just kind of forget about it, unless it wasn't actually really trauma to begin with. Not to say that she didn't experience something traumatic, but I think it's possible that despite having experienced something traumatic, she wasn't really carrying trauma with her. She was carrying the idea that she should be traumatized with her and running with that when she was using it to justify or like using that fact as like a component of what she was feeling. Like it didn't actually feel like genuinely like I'm responding this way because I'm traumatized. I'm responding this way, and the fact that I should be traumatized is a good explanation for it.
That actually might have been an interesting way to deal with it. Like, what is expected of you, along with whatever societal rules we have going on here, which, don't exist, but like how you're supposed to respond to things. And I had an idea of like the reason for this marriage being more so the Cunninghams wanted her married to somebody, like they were the ones pushing because they didn't want her to be alone. And they knew she couldn't go to Camhurst, or they were assuming that, right? Like, if they have thought of her as traumatized child, which would make sense, then we set up a lot more stable foundations as to why things are happening as they're happening. And it also would be an interesting way to play with perception in the book, right? Because she is supposed to be traumatized, and she's not good at social situations, even though she seems to be just fine. And we can get into her neurodivergence later, because we get more hints of it. And we could kind of have that imbalance of how she is supposed to act in public as a traumatized person, and then how she actually is. And I don't know, the Cunninghams could have played a bigger role in helping to, like, shift this into something almost darker, and then make Jane even more unreliable as a narrator.
Right.
Or if you did something where she's using trauma as a way to act how she wants. But it's like, are you romanticizing trauma in that instance? I mean, this book kind of says fuck you to, like, disabilities and mental health, so I guess it doesn't matter, right? But
yeah.
I don't know. There's just, like, there's something that could be done there. I don't have the full thought.
It does kind of exist in the space between where it could be good, like where it could be good as a unreliable narrator, and there's not enough information here for it to work as is. Like by that I mean, like you said, we're this is a book, we're getting Jane's story, this is kind of supposed to be from Jane's perspective. I would expect then that if this trauma really did matter to her and really was a part of her, we would have gotten more of it, or like at least a more solid basis for believing it, other than just like hearing about that there was this war and like shading the Ruskin characters throughout because of it. Like I would expect there to be something more substantial for us to grab onto in order to believe that it was real. I think in order for it to go the other direction of like the unreliable narrator part, we would have needed some sort of third party source to kind of validate that. And like you said, the Cunninghams could have been that. So I think it's just because it's in between those two things, it's hard for me to believe either of them.
I don't understand what becomes unreliable about her, or what becomes twisted about her. Like, I guess the fact that she has made an Augustine is kind of crazy.
That part's weird, yeah.
That part is really fucking crazy. Especially because it's not like Augustine, it is, the Augustine she wanted, even though she met him like 2 weeks ago. It's fine.
Ridiculous. The part we were complaining about in the first half. Yeah.
But I don't know, like, I just didn't get unreliable narrator from this. But obviously we were supposed to.
Yeah, like, do you think that's what that conversation with Nizamiev was trying to establish?
I took it as, like, Nizamiev wanted Jane to admit it for, like, research purposes. Either so that she could figure out what happened and talk to Jane about it more, or she could declare Jane as crazy and take her. I don't know. I took it as, like, research opportunity.
I suppose, but, like, she really didn't, I don't know, need to approach it that way, I guess. I understand she's kind of a colder character, but I guess I don't understand. I liked Nizamiev more in the first half of the book when, I don't know, it felt like she was kind of like giving her the information, right? This interaction at the end made no sense. The only thing that it felt like it was doing was saying, don't forget she's Ruskin and Ruskins are bad. And she's being distant and cold here because she's actually a villain because she's Ruskin. Like, that's what I was feeling from that. I wasn't actually feeling like... I wasn't actually feeling like there was... I don't know. Like, I didn't understand what the point was for that other than antagonizing her and I guess, like, solidifying that Jane wasn't going to talk about it anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it also could have been a concrete declaration that Jane wasn't going to do magic anymore.
I think that's BS.
But yeah, even that, like, this book ended on like some kind of Goosebumps ending where the light turns out and you're like, oh my god, what happened? Because that's what happens when like the ghouls show up. So you're like, did she actually give up magic or is she doing something else? We don't know.
Yeah, it did feel like there was a wink at the end of it, but I don't think the author actually tried to put it there. I just think it was insufficient to believe it.
Yeah, because Jane, as she did in the first half of this book, is kind of back and forth. Is she using magic to save Lawrence and that's it? Is she using it for herself? Does she get consumed by the power? Probably. But also there's like weird lines about unpracticed magicians being the ones that end up going mad or having deformities or
Right.
whatever. And it's like, based on evidence in this book, any magician, anyone using magic for basically a prolonged period of time will end up facing consequences because of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Based on what we've seen. So like that unpracticed line made no sense to me. So like it doesn't make sense for even Jane to want to use it again. I don't know. I think it's confusing, right? Because this is gothic horror, so I think the book isn't supposed to necessarily have a quote-unquote happy end. I don't think it does. I'm not disillusioned here. But it also doesn't have a satisfying end. And you could say, oh, but it's like gothic horror. Like, it didn't all turn out how you wanted it to turn out. And it's like, okay, fair. But certain gothic horrors do have satisfying endings, right? Like Frankenstein is pretty satisfying at the end. It's like sad and not everything gets worked out. Like people fucking die. But it felt like a full story.
Well, yeah, it at least feels worth it, right?
Right. This book had cyclical elements, but they felt cyclical in like a bad way. Like redoing the Elodie death and having to fix the house by basically doing what broke the house. Like in certain circumstances that would make sense. But when you've established a universe in which magic is 100% negative and only ruins your life and like everybody else's life, that's when satisfaction kind of leaves the equation, because it's like you're fighting fire with fire and two wrongs don't make a right. Like it's hard to explain because I understand the genre would call for like an ending that isn't satisfying in the everything worked out just fine angle, but at least for me, I like none of it even felt satisfying. Like how we were solving problems, the realizations that Jane was having, the whole thing about Zero Jane, like just like none of it felt very fulfilling or cleansing. Like we were talking about cleansing this house and cleansing guilt, and it's like we can deal with all of those things because I think also gothic horror is very human. Like Frankenstein is one of my faves, so I will just mention it. But like, there's the whole section in the middle that people find boring as hell that is just about being human and learning how to be human. And too much of Paradise Lost, to be honest. Mm-hmm. But you have to have the human part of it to kind of build up the inhuman part of it. But you had inhuman magic, and then you had characters who did not even feel human. So a lot of it just fell so it fell so very flat, I guess. I don't know if that made sense. Like,
yeah, it did.
It's just tough because Jane was an interesting character in the beginning.
Yeah.
And I think if that Jane had written throughout the whole thing, we might have had something here. Mm-hmm. You know?
I
like
agree.
Somebody who wants to logic through magic. Not because magic is built on logic, but just because she uses logic. Like, if you would have made some kind of almost battle between those two things, because it's, I don't know, it's like you've had the character use the evil thing to free them from the evil thing, which is like, some stories you become the bad guy so that you can, like, help people, right. That whole storyline, but that is also for the intent of helping people. You're also trying to do a thing where you're just power hungry at the end. And being hungry is part of the experience. From Jane and from the ghouls, and like, that's part of magic as well, and you're feeding into it.
Yeah, like, do you think the story would have been slightly more satisfying at the end if she had just been like, I am gonna go do more magic? If there was more of the evil twinkle in her eye?
Maybe, because, like, but the issue is, like, another problem is everybody who uses magic in this book is...
yeah, they, like, die.
well, that, and also the mentally ill and like the disabled perspective, right?
Yeah.
And that's apparently what you need to be a magician. Sign me up, I guess. So it's like, because we also get a bit about Jane not making eye contact and not fitting in social situation. And it's like, okay, she's autistic then, which is a simplification of what it means to be autistic. But I feel like those are very subtle hints towards that.
This is literature, yeah.
But then you get into, like, okay, so these are the people using magic. People that are disabled or are mentally ill or are neurodivergent or are just desperate, right? And how does that fit within our history, right? We have the witch hunts.
Yeah.
And then we have shit like the satanic panic, right? Where you thought somebody was possessed by the devil because they like to sit in the corner and not talk to anybody. Or you had changelings, which people thought were like fae replaced with their children because they were a little off or they didn't speak at an appropriate time period. And it's like, no, that's not how that worked. But like, I doubt this was intentional. But the similarities I was feeling between these two things, like, you can't villainize Jane in a story like this because of what she and magic users represent in the story. But that is what happens. Like, there is no good use of magic. And even Jane's use of it is at least tainted a bit by her want of power and her want to know. Because Zero Jane could have stopped it at any time. It is self-fulfilling so that she ends up exactly where she needs to be to have the ethereal experience she has.
Right.
You could supposedly have not locked Augustine in the crypt and even used magic to break whatever illusion he was having about yellow fever, and then things would seemingly be fine. You could have even maybe used magic to go back and stop Elodie from even dying, which I thought was a possibility.
Oh, I didn't even think about that, actually. I know she was, like, playing with her own timeline on that. Like, oh, do I, like, let him come back up the stairs, or do I put the stone back? Yeah, I didn't think about the Elodie one.
Because Elodie makes a weird comment in the journal where she's like, oh, Lawrence is like a brother to me. It's so weird we're getting married.
God,
I'm like,
odd.
why mention it?
Yeah.
Why bring that up if we don't even care about this character? So I thought she was somehow going to come back, and that's how the house was going to be cleansed, because it was going to be about Elodie. That's not the case. But I don't know. There's just like something, I'm going to say it again, probably not intentional. I doubt it. I think it's just so easy to fall into these kind of tropes in which, like we talked about in the first part, the people that are mad are the ones that understand what's really going on. That's just how it goes. And there is something about Mrs. Pearl and Lethbridge thinking Jane is insane because she knows the house is haunted. And it's like, yeah, she is understanding reality in that moment, but she is also kind of insane. Like, point blank, she is doing things she should not be doing. And using magic, which we've established in this book, is exceedingly dark and damaging. And there's like nothing redeeming about it. So yes, she is insane. She is crazy. She is mad. And that is what you need to be to use magic, especially if you're depriving yourself of everything for 7 days. You are going to be crazy by the end of it. That is just how that works. But you have to suffer to use magic, and you will suffer using magic. And there's just nothing good about it. And you'll disable yourself, you'll ruin your mind, all of these things.
Yeah, can we talk about the writhing mass that is extracted from her and how it, like, vaguely, I guess, is supposed to resemble Augustine's features?
I do remember Jane mentioning it has, like, the truths of him she didn't know, which I don't know how that's possible, but okay.
It had a green eye. I was like, did Augustine have green eyes? Maybe. But...
Oh, ew. I must have glazed over. It was like 11 p.m. I was finishing this book. I was tired.
It was gross. Like, better off, it was disgusting to read. And I was like, this kind of ended up upsetting me for some different reasons too, because I think I mentioned a little bit in the last episode of, like, crazy how Jane started the book being like, I want to be independent, and, like, I just want a business arrangement, and then by the end of the end of the first half, she's doing dishes at his house. And so this part upset me because there was kind of that obsession with consummation for a portion of the first half. The second half opens up with her, like, caring for Abigail, who is pregnant, and, like, a lot of focus on this failed pregnancy and things. And then she like has this mass growing in her that is in the resemblance of her husband, which like also kind of alludes to pregnancy. And I'm like, I just don't know how many like references to like traditional like marriage or traditional heteronormative things, tropes, whatever there has to be in a book that made you think that the main character might be interested in independence.
Yeah, also this idea that this mass or this child, even though they're burning it, whatever, it's like it is the way to kind of restart, right? Like to fix the past, which first of all, don't do that. You still have trauma. Don't put that on a child.
Right.
But like when you have a broken home and you think the way to fix it is to have a child.
Right. Yeah.
Or to somehow trap them. You know, that happens too with like a pregnancy. Because it does kind of like, if it does have parts of Augustine that she doesn't know, that help him become more human, basically, which I think is what's described, then it does kind of trap him with her because of it. Like, it solidifies him as some kind of entity because of the magic she did. So now they're able to exist together. It's kind of like a finishing of that spell.
I feel like this is giving me the ick I was feeling last episode.
It is, oh my god, wait, it is kind of like trapping somebody by having a kid with them.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my god. He's obviously not the same person she married, but he is like an Augustine.
No, he is, yeah.
That's crazy.
The fact that she's going to spend the rest of her life with him.
It's like, it's so strange, because she obviously has all of the power in this scenario, right? And she could, theoretically, change parts of him as she wishes. She made him. That's the assumption I have. I mean, she'd be working magic, but she might still work it after this anyway.
Right.
Which is another thing. Like, he is not alive. I don't care what she says. Because how do you magic somebody alive when knowing what being alive means is not known? You do not know what that means. From a philosophical standpoint, especially in this time period, you do not know it with a capital N.
Yeah.
You're not bringing anybody back or recreating them in a sense in which they could be alive. But that's a magic discussion again. I guess we don't need to talk about it. But what I was saying was, yeah, she supposedly has the power in this scenario. But yet, at the end of the book, she is like, whatever my husband wants. And it's so confusing. I feel like we talked about the very end.
Yeah.
But she has like a line about her husband's salvation mattering more than anything. And then, yeah, she goes to Camhurst, which is crazy because we've set this whole book up on the presumption that she cannot go to Camhurst. But I guess trauma is obsolete when you go through new trauma.
It just doesn't feel earned, you know? I just the same way, like, so that I had some issue with the title not being what happened for real. I mean, she does die, but, like, you know, she doesn't die, right? And, like, that's fine. I think that's not, like, uncommon to kind of play with something like that, like a title, but it didn't feel earned, or it didn't feel like, I don't know, I thought that the story would have been more interesting if it had led to her death somehow, like her actual death, and maybe ended like 2 chapters sooner, you know? Yeah, it didn't make sense to me that they'd go to Camhurst after the talk of it not being of interest to Jane at all, and not exploring the idea at all, and not seeing any development, like talking it away in the 2 lines. Just, no, I wasn't about that.
Yeah, and the idea of them going there partly because Jane could go to school. And because this isn't Lawrence, you have to wonder, is this a Lawrence idea or is this Jane projecting through Lawrence?
I didn't even think of that. That's a great point.
Again, this could have tied back to your idea of her acting as somebody with trauma should act versus actually having trauma. This could have been a good way to kind of, again, play with that unreliable aspect of her not actually having trauma, but you'd have to change aspects of this book, right? Like the reason for the Cunninghams and not going before and some of the other stuff. But it could have been a good moment to kind of play with or give insight into like, she actually would go, but this, and this. Like, she's not supposed to go because she is traumatized, quote unquote traumatized, but she does actually want to go.
I could even see like a second half to that story where she's in Camhurst and he's like, oh my god, I'm feeling so traumatized because I'm back here. Like, I wish Augustine hadn't told us to do this, you know?
Yeah, it's just, it's just so pass off at the end. Like, it's such a quick decision they come to. And I guess it is impossible to know if it's him or her, but it wouldn't make sense for it to be her if if we believe the trauma has been adequate, like, not adequate, if we believe the trauma has been an actuality this entire book, which I'm presuming it is. I don't think that's part of the unreliable part, but it would have been interesting, I suppose.
There's some books that I don't think this falls into the category of like it's so bad I there's so much I want to say. Like I think I definitely had my opinions about it, but like I think there's a zone of things I don't like where I just don't care, right? Like I've hit the neutral zone, whereas there's a zone of things that I don't like but I care enough to actively not like,
Mm-hmm.
And I think this one is it's just off for me. I don't think I'm going to think about this book much afterwards.
I can kind of I feel like I could complain more about this book. I have some things in the notes, like about zeros and circles, and I could get into it, right? But I kind of agree, like, once I kind of rate it and I'm done with it, it'll probably be over. And that's fine. It's kind of disappointing because this was something I actually wanted to read, basically since it came out, and this is how it's gone. So that's kind of a bummer. Final review-wise, though, it was definitely a book I would not have finished if not for this podcast. For that reason, I think this is the first time I've given this. I'm giving this a 1 star.
I figured.
Yeah.
Well, I've been dancing around on it a little bit. I think the only thing that's keeping me from just going ahead with the 1 myself is that kind of feeling I explained at the end of the first episode where it felt like nothing was happening, but like I still kind of wanted to know what was going to happen. And maybe I shouldn't give it that much credit for like what I think is actually probably my own personal curiosity and intrigue and things, but I'm willing, I think, to give this book a 2. The reason I'm struggling with it on the other end, the part where I don't think it deserves that much credit, is it's a little hard to see it being worse, honestly. And not to say that like I want to like contextualize that and not make it seem like another dig at the author, but more so just like we've talked about it being a mismatch. I didn't like the story. I mean, foundationally, it had me in the first 30 pages and that was it. It's hard to like imagine reading through another full fiction book like this one and like feeling less satisfied with it. I don't know. I don't know if it's out there. I guess I'm leaving the space for it because I think I'm going to stick with the 2, but
okay.
We got to give this some good vibes.
I can also go first in this.
Sure.
You mentioned it pretty quickly. Those first 30 pages.
Mm-hmm.
Guesstimating here, but the directness of Jane at the beginning, the banter between the two of them, basically before they got married and fell in love, was good. I think I even note in the first part, like, I enjoyed that aspect of the story. And the marriage of convenience was a fun idea because that is an interesting concept, right? Like, somebody in a marriage of convenience stuck within this kind of horror going on. Like, how do you react? What do you do? Especially when you have the universe kind of pushing you in its direction, which is what you could consider all the coincidence going on, right? So that's an interesting idea. It has some good banter. The potential of banter was there. The writing for that was very good. And that's my good vibe.
I support it. I feel like OG Jane as the good vibe makes sense. I think the thing I can give this book the most credit for is being more than just a historical fiction. Now I know I feel like I felt like I was deceived by that a little bit, but let me say a little bit more so it's not just about being deceived. It did end up being a bit of a romance, which is not my thing, and maybe it doesn't deserve a lot of credit of its own. But the part that I really want to focus on is that it still was a horror book, and I kind of thought it wasn't going to be after some period of time. I feel like the second half of the book was pretty solidly the horror chunk of the book. There was still a little bit of the romance trope. We didn't get into this in the episode, but they had some tension at the beginning of the second half that was typical of like that part of the book where the two people stop seeing each other for a second, or they get into a petty argument and then they end up together at the end anyway. So that does still happen, but there's a really big gap in the middle where we get to like dive into the horror. I of course didn't find it to be the most satisfying horror, but I'm glad that it at least made an attempt and had a bit of a diversity to it beyond just the supposed historical fiction setting. So that is my good vibe.
And that's the death of Jane Lawrence.
Boy, is it.
As always, if you disagree with us, have any comments, And then obviously theories aspects, if you want to hit us up. The Twitter is 5050_books. And then everything else is in the description. For next time, we are jumping into something hopefully fun. It is Suddenly a Murder by Lauren Munoz. It's a YA mystery. I'm assuming mystery. It's about murder.
A mystery, yeah.
Yeah. We have a high school setting. We have a group of friends having a 1920s themed kind of party. But then obviously, suddenly, a murder happens. So we kind of get like a fun... I mean, I say fun, it's a murder, but it seems fun because they're dressed in 1920s. Murder mystery. It felt very Clue vibes when we picked this book, at least to me. So I'm hoping for a bit of a lighter tone with that. And then halfway, we are reading up to, but not including chapter 22. Hopefully fun vibes for next time.
Yeah, hopefully so.
Yeah, we try and change it up. We don't like to do horror after horror or, you know... We got stuck in another time book, which was very strange. That wasn't the intent when we picked Jane Lawrence, but people love time.
I'm telling you, we try. We try.
Oh, definitely. Oh, also, if you have any book recommendations, you can also hit us up on the Twitter. That would be very helpful.
Ideal even, yeah.
Especially for historical fiction, we are 0 for 2.
Yeah.
So that'd be useful. And we'll see you next time.
Bye.